Yeah, I also feel this compulsion to talk to people about the two presentations that just happened, but here we go. So, I'm gonna have a list of questions and then a proposal, and of course somebody had to talk about reinforcement learning, so I'll be that person.
Thank you.
And then, I just wanted to thank, Mike Levin is a name that might be familiar to some of you. He does a lot of really interesting work in biology. He discovered that electric fields really change development and like a whole lot of other stuff. I just also want to thank the undergrads that helped work on the list of questions part. So, list of questions about agency. So, I know that reinforcement learning, you might have some quibbles about it because maybe it doesn't include time delays in the way that you want. Maybe it doesn't go to continuous time the way that you want. You know, you can imagine a whole bunch of technical difficulties with it. So I'm just saying, imagine reinforcement learning in full glory, continuous time, POM DPs, time delays, continuous mixed state, action spaces, just whatever mathematical apparatus you want. And we're just going to ignore the technical details for now. And the basic idea with reinforcement learning is that there's some reward, some total rewards that you want to maximize, and you're trying to do so. And you learn from reinforcement in order to do that. And let's start with how to define an agent. So I did not have the benefit of Yuri's presentation before I wrote this slide. So I just wrote something down that seemed reasonable to me, and it's very reinforcement learning-ish. So let's assume you have control over the environment to some extent, not completely. I just sort of had a simple idea, which is if you watch an agent's actions and you do inverse reinforcement learning to try and figure out the reward function, and you infer a reward function, and then you change the environment in some way, and you do this again. So you change the reward structure and do this again. If you have the same reward function, then maybe I would start to call it an agent. I just sort of imagined that tools could be called agents incorrectly, and I didn't see that table before the slide, obviously. And if you did this on a tool, you would get two different reward functions, whereas for an agent, the two reward functions would be somewhat similar. Okay, there you go. Okay, so relatedly, how low can you go? So you could even think of genetic regulatory circuits as being agents. They can definitely do prediction. So I had Gabby and Ava simulate a simple model of a genetic regulatory circuit, and they sent in movies, and they were trying to predict the movies using the output of the genetic regulatory circuit. They sent in the middle pixel of the movie as something that monitored one of the links in this genetic regulatory circuit. And you can actually predict to some extent what the future central pixel of the movie is going to be. Okay.
Isn't it just because there's correlation?
Yeah. So I mean, mathematically, this isn't so weird. Mathematically, this is just you have some input-dependent dynamical system. You send in an input. The input is correlated with the future, and so naturally, you end up getting some correlations with everything. It is sort of an example, though, of how genetic regulatory circuits can do this kind of thing. And if you were just looking at prediction as a measure of agency, you would call them agents. I'm not going to stick to those as being agents. These are just some questions that came from thinking about agency in biology. So if you think about an organism, it's kind of like a reinforcement learner, composed of reinforcement learners, if you want to go there. Swarms and flocks have one of their own. So you have a body with a whole bunch of organs. They're all learning with reinforcement, and the body is trying to learn with reinforcement. So here are some examples. You have a biofilm or a tumor, or you have swarm robotics. And so some questions we're asking is, how do you conceptualize having reinforcement learners in a reinforcement learner? How does that even work? Why would biology do that? Is that more efficient in some way? If it is more efficient in some way, how does that efficiency scale with size? So if you have a bigger body, do you want to have more reinforcement learning organs? And if you have a smaller body, is there redundancy, or do the reinforcement learners act synergistically? It seems like multi-agent reinforcement learning would be the appropriate framework. That's when you have a whole bunch of agents and they're all doing reinforcement learning, and they sort of, you could sort of say there's some sort of emergent thing that's going on, which is that a bunch of agents are sort of acting like they're a superorganism. How do you understand that? I remember at Iliad there was a whole bunch of people talking about emergence. Just a question. Okay, this is another thing, environments with agencies. So maybe the wind wants to do something. Probably not, but how do you identify when the environment has agency? Does it philosophically make sense that the wind wants to do something? Probably not. You could imagine that the environment, if it has agency, could be benevolent, like maybe it's trying to get the agent what it wants. It could be malevolent, it's trying to deny the agent what it wants, or benign, or anything on that spectrum. Is there a way of identifying what kind of agency the environment has, if it has agency? Maybe there's some sort of quantitative measure. What kinds of agencies do environments typically have? I've seen artificial naturalistic experiments, and if there's agency, does this affect our typical analyses at all? So, you know, if you take a typical reinforcement learning experiment and you change it to an environment that has some sort of agency, would you have to do a different sort of weirder analysis? When the environment fluctuates a lot, how do you learn quickly? So usually the environment is not stationary, something is fluctuating. Well, in this particular case with biological heuristics, outperform complicated reinforcement learning algorithms by adjusting as quickly and well enough. And then, of course, just looking into like bio-inspired computing. Is there a data efficient, effective algorithm that we can steal from biological organisms? This one was something that Mike Levin pointed out. So, just a whole bunch of examples of how to survive if someone kills half your intelligence. So, planary regenerate if you cut them into pieces. Human embryos develop fully functional twins if the early embryos split in half. Caterpillar brains get taken apart and put back together, but the butterfly remembers everything. Salamanders regenerate. Squirrels lose a third of their brain mass in the winter, and yet they remember all the information about where they place stuff. So how does that happen? Is this ability some weird form of regularization? There are also examples of where we really want to have as much volume as possible. So there's this thing called the minimal cortical wiring hypothesis in neuroscience. It's basically about how you want to make the brain as small as possible because you have to get it out of your mom's vagina, but all that is very precious to you. All that volume is very precious to you. So you're robust to some things, you're not robust to other things. What determines what you're robust to?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
How apart exactly do caterpillar brains get taken?
Oh, you'd have to ask Mike Levin.
Okay.
I think it's caterpillar to butterfly.
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
But like, does the
What does that mean? The
all the
butterfly
neurons-
remembers everything.
Yeah.
That's the thing that.
The butterfly knows stuff that the caterpillar knows, and I don't know how they know that.
How did they know that?
But like, did the caterpillar, was they just born knowing that? To begin with? Or
it's
did
so-
it learn?
I don't know the way you're talking. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I should read the paper. Yeah.
Oh,
It's
so
published
you have
somewhere,
to
right?
have to ask Mike
Is it
Levin.
Mike Levin's paper?
Yeah. So he just sort of stated this as fact. He might have cited it in the
Mike
paper.
Levin states a lot of things.
Yeah, so I just stated it as fact. There might be reference in the paper. There might not be reference in this paper, but
You cited your source.
yeah. I didn't mean to say myself. This is where we put all these questions and all this stuff. So I just sort of want to make this point that you could look at all this weird ass biology to get interesting questions for agencies and this reinforcement learning. And I'm going to go into a version of reinforcement learning next that I think might describe organisms. So
What does it say?
a proposal for understanding agency of organisms. I want to see this slide. I'm sort of realizing it. So as I'm sitting here, I'm realizing that agency is such a loaded term that I kind of want to skip the word agency and everything, and I just kind of want to say,
Sorry.
this is a proposal for understanding organisms, and just forget the agency in.
I feel like we're here to argue about the
Yeah,
word.
it's
Yeah,
okay.
that's why we're here.
It's okay.
Yeah,
You want
I
to
feel-
bracket out the conference?
I'm just here talking about something completely separate. So, okay, so you guys may have heard of Mars levels. I really like Mars levels. There is and basically it's sort of a question of how to understand the organism. So the computational levels, what is it trying to do? You could imagine that the current answer to this would be it's trying to gather a reward from the environment, something like that. Algorithmic level, how is it doing it? You could imagine that it's inferring a belief state, that would be part of your algorithm. Mechanistic level, what molecules, et cetera, is it using to do this? So exactly what is the biology? And sort of, it's really helped me to kind of think about the problems that I have using these three levels, because usually I say sort of at the computational level and algorithmic level, with some not mechanistic level. So what we have here that I'm going to tell you about is a testable proposal for a computational level objective with mechanistic level constraints. It's about how to understand how an organism is behaving. Okay, so we're going to start with reinforcement learning. This is not where we're ending up, but this is where we're starting. So there's this sort of sum total of discounted rewards that we're trying to maximize. Is it that, or is it something like more complicated than that? I'm not sure, but basically you've got something with an internal state, it takes an action, the world environment changes, but it tells you what reward you got, and it gives you an observation that helps you update your internal state, and your action also helps you update your internal state. So the end result of this objective tells you that what you want to have here is the belief state, which people already kind of knew. But you also want it to be sort of a minimal thing, so you don't want it to be like, you don't want to have extra dimensions that you're not using. And so it's sort of a rate distortion theory not here. And it tells you the actions that you want to take, it can range from stochastic to deterministic, depending on a parameter I'm going to tell you about. Okay, so resource rational reinforcement learning. So you may have heard of resource rational decision making. It's a very simple idea that's been around for a while that I really, really like. So it's basically we are organisms that are trying to make decisions about what to do so that we can survive. But we have limited resources, we have a limited brain size, we have limited energy, we have limited time, and under all these constraints we have to make some decision that's good enough. So the idea behind resource rational decision making is that we use our resources well in order to make decisions. So how do you put in these resource constraints into reinforcement learning? I still wanted to maximize this or some version of this. Again, I'm not completely wedded to this as being like the thing that you must maximize. It could be some weird thing that's not just a sum total discounted rewards. But just generally the idea that you're maximizing something about reward in the future, long-term reward. These are the resources that I put in. I do not think that these are exactly the resources that are being used. I think they're correlated with them. And so they're sort of a first stab at getting at what's going on. So let me go through both of these. This is the mutual information between the sensory state, your internal state right here, and the action that you're going to take. And this right here is mutual information between your internal state and the history of actions and observations. And so those are the two things that I'm saying that you're trying to construct. Okay, so why these constraints? Constraint number one, I'm definitely not the first person to have put this in to resource rational decision making. I think Sam Gershman put this in. Yeah, Sam Gershman put this in. So brains are a noisy channel. This is limiting your actuator's ability to select the right policy. I'm not thinking about this in terms of the fundamental theorems in information theory because I don't think the assumptions merit doing that. I'm just thinking about mutual information as essentially a nonlinear correlation coefficient, or like a really good one. So if there's a noisy channel that transmits information about the sensor to the actuator, which there definitely is, like you look at nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, they are a noisy channel. This captures how much information you can transmit. And the more information you can transmit, the better informed your actions based on your sensory state. It's possible that there may be a loose justification for this in terms of the rate distortion theorem, but I'm not wedding myself to that. So it could be that if the NMJ, the neuromuscular junction, is a rate code, you could sort of say that this is a very reasonable constraint because of the rate distortion theorem. I'm just not wedding myself to that because I don't know that the neuromuscular junction is a rate code. Constraint number two, okay. Originally, this constraint came from Suzanne Still, so it's the mutual information between internal state and history, and this is basically because your memory is limited, and this limits the ability of the sensor to encode the needed belief state. It's in like a Palmer paper, and there's a Ferdinand et al. Paper that's under review right now. It's a proxy for memory about the environment. In fact, it's correlated with working memory in this Ferdinand et al. Paper. The more memory you have, the better you are able to take an action that maximizes your total discounted reward. So if you want to do a really good job, you want this to be high. But if you have sort of limited resources, like you're not devoting a whole lot of working memory to a task, you're not going to make this very large. This is probably way more loosely related to the rate distortion theorem. It may be related to non-equilibrium thermodynamics, or maybe this is just a good empirical proxy for memory, which is just like, maybe this is a quantity that kind of correlates two things that, when correlated, relate to something having to do with memory. So I'm not saying that there are fundamental things saying that this is the right thing. If you only have the first constraint, you can kind of explain what's going on in behavioral experiments. Don't ask me to tell you exactly what's going on in this experiment here. It's just this right here is mutual information between the internal state and the action, and this is the average reward. Sam Gershman had a paper where he basically he didn't have the mutual information between the internal state and the history as a constraint, and he just had that first constraint, that constraint number 1. And there's this line right here that tells you that this is as well as it can do. So given that amount of policy complexity, that amount of mutual information between the internal state and the actuator, this is the most average reward you can get from the experiment that he had. And you see humans are sort of all over the place, and they're not like right at that line. So the hope with this all is that the hope will fixtualize this reward rate manifold, and the idea would be that you have this resource and this resource, and again, these are sort of correlated with resources that people are talking about, rather than being, like, maybe they are fundamental limits, but maybe they're just correlated. And you have on the z-axis the thing that reinforcement learning is trying to maximize, and you sort of trace out this manifold where for this amount of this constraint and this amount of this constraint, you can get at most this much v pi. And then the hope would be that if you looked at where organisms were relative to this reward rate manifold, they would be close to the reward rate manifold. And so it's a testable hypothesis. Basically, the testable hypothesis is if you do set up an experiment where you can compute this reward rate manifold, which is actually very hard to compute, and you look at where organisms lie, they lie very close to the reward rate manifold. Okay, so you can turn this constrained objective into an unconstrained objective by putting Lagrange multipliers here and here. And there's an entire algorithm for getting this, but the first thing you probably would notice is that this H contains the entire history of actions and observations. That's not very useful for working with. So it turns out that if you're doing an optimal job, you can work with this history of actions and observations with the belief state, with sensory motor causal states. This leads to equations. This is sort of like a generalized Blockwood area model algorithm that you can try to solve to get these reward rate manifolds. You still have recursive dimensionality because you still have to figure out, because as soon as you change your policy, you have sort of a different relationship with the belief state, but you have to refigure out the belief state. But other than that, this is a generalized Blockwood area model algorithm for getting everything, and it leads to this algorithm. I haven't gotten this algorithm to work yet, so I'm going to skip it. But it's somehow the code just doesn't run right. But I think instead I'll show you the thing that worked, which is I did sort of a Gaussian take with like a mean squared error kind of thing, and I was able to get not analytic solutions like you would with the information bottleneck, but something that I could actually compute and plot. You may notice sort of there's spikes, so it's still hard to actually get the solution. But this would be constraint number 1, this would be constraint number 2, and then this axis is the total expected reward, and it's just sort of this is what the reward rate manifold looks like. So this is for when the reward is negative, the square difference between the action and the world state, and I just chose that so that the math would work out so that I could actually compute something. The derived and actually the derived equations were necessary because the derived equations, the generalized Blockwood area model algorithm, told you that the answer was for the organism to be a linear dynamical system with Gaussian noise in order to do a good job, and then you can numerically optimize your function to get the following approximate reward rate manifold. Okay.
So the organism is a living process.
The organism in that case, okay, actually, I have to make a quick distinction. So that gets you the rewarding manifold. So it's sort of like the optimal soft clusters, if sort of getting to exactly these points would be a linear dynamical system with Gaussian noise. But it's possible that you could get very close to that without being a linear dynamical system with Gaussian noise. I just sort of speculate. There's this really interesting paper by Solani et al. And Cannias from a long time ago about bacteria. And what they say is that bacteria don't seem to be trying to gather as much reward as possible. They seem to be sort of assuming the worst case scenario, which is that the gradients are going to vanish and acting accordingly. And they have this really nice way of predicting from that principle exactly how they respond to history of chemoattractant. So if that's true, I feel like there's sort of a complexity of organisms, and at a certain complexity level, you turn from something that acts like the environment is going to be in the worst case scenario to something that actually tries to gather reward and assumes that you can actually gather reward. And I feel like the key thing is, do you have like a theory of mind about what's going to happen? Because if you have some like model of the environment, then you're able to actually gather reward, and if not, you're best off just assuming the worst case scenario. And bacteria are definitely in this category. I don't know where this transition is, but
So this is the emergence of agency.
yeah. If people are interested, I would like to show you the paper later, the Solani paper. It's really interesting. I mean, I can say all these words up here about this and this and this, but what is really cool about that paper is that they write down a very, very, very simple objective function, and then they use it to predict something that they measured in an experiment, and they nail it. And so I really do think that bacteria, despite what people think about them trying to maximize velocity up the gradient or something like that, it's not really that. It's actually they're trying to do their best in the worst case scenario.
Are you also suggesting that if you can't be an agent if you're trying to maximize given worst case scenarios?
See, I don't know how I think about that. Yeah. So is this the emergence of agency, like this right here is where the agency starts, and then, or is it that you have to just sort of redefine agents so that if they say, you know what, this environment is too tough, and I'm just going to do my best job in a worst case scenario, like maybe you're still an agent, because we're faced with that all the time. Like in the political landscape today, trying to get a grant with Trump at the helm is kind of like doing your best in a worst case scenario, and you can't make a model of anything. Like all of our models about grantsmanship would fail because try to make a model of what the NIH is going to like right now, and it's going to fail. So
But you have these results on the space of random neural networks. It's perfect for this environment.
See, yeah, but maybe it's not. Actually, that's the Solani paper, right? It's like even when you say like I give up, I should just do my best in the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
You have to figure out the worst case scenario and then optimize for that. And so it's not random that actually works. It's like something very stereotyped. And so I don't even if our grantsmanship efforts fail in the current political environment with Trump, we still have to do a good job on a grant somehow, and we still need a model of how to do a good job on a grant. So I don't know if I would say that bacteria are not agents or if they are agents, but it is a very interesting paper.
Is it about bacteria like generically, or is it one particular bacteria? Is there enough diversity in behavior where some bacteria could do this, other bacteria could do something else?
You could ask sort of like what lab strain they used. I think the original paper that they based this on was based out of like Steve Block's lab, and they just took like a very normal lab strain of bacteria, pinned it down, and showed it a chemoattractant concentration, and they monitored what its propensity for changing from running to tumbling was. And that's
Can I ask a question about and you may have said it now, there's so many ideas, I'm thinking about the last thing you said maybe, but does it matter what order the phase, this is a physics question, does it matter what order the phase transition is? I mean, and I don't have an opinion, but there was a question like, a long time ago, remember Mark Potter's.
What would different answers mean to that question?
Yeah, I don't know, that's what I'm wondering, but the thing is, like their question and again, worst case scenario in the sense of low signal to noise ratio, they were looking at, you have to fly, you're on the lobular plate, good H1, it's supposed to detect right after motion, it's crucial for the flight, right? And if you go between low signal to noise and high signal to noise, they see this. but they see a change in behavior. You go from the Reichardt model to and I think biologically that hasn't borne out. But whatever, if we accept that model, it turns out in their case they couldn't prove it, but it looked like there was no phase transition. There was a smooth transition from these two different regimes. And I'm wondering, like, does it have to be that you're an agent or you're not, or can it be that there's no phase transition and it smoothly goes? And I just wonder how much evidence you've seen or what ideas you've got about that.
Yeah, so I've only ever seen the Solani papers like objective function describe bacteria. So the only thing I can say is bacteria over here, like rats are definitely somewhere over here, probably, and so are humans.
Interesting.
Like, okay, so I think that if you looked at this, so the reviewer asked, like, well, how would you measure, like, what would be your order parameter? So I put up something. It was the size of the body devoted to the theory of mind of other organisms. And you could sort of make it like size of the body devoted to the theory of just like what else is going on in the environment. Because clearly bacteria have nothing devoted to that. They are, if they're doing this worst case scenario thing, evolution has already told them the worst case scenario is that the gradients vanish as soon as you try to ascend them. And so then they're planning for that. And they don't need to know anything else. They don't really need to sense the environment in a way that would be how we would sense the environment and then take an action. And so they're literally at like 0. And so it would be sort of a sharp transition, but it would be like a first order transition probably.
Can you
Interesting.
with that fraction of the body devoted to a theory of mind, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
So
Well,
there's like a portion of our brain. Yeah, maybe you want to
You want a brain?
There's it's sort
Neurons.
of,
I lectured on it yesterday.
Like neurons. Okay.
Yeah. But I'm allowing for organisms that have things that we would not call brains, but are precursors to brains that have part of them devoted to a theory.
Computation structure.
Yeah.
By the way, even in humans, it's maybe a fraction of a percent.
It doesn't. I
It's more
mean,
than
as
that.
long as it's not 0,
Well,
it sort of makes it.
Wouldn't it be granular prefrontal cortex? Like
All of that, the theory of
a tenth of it would still be more than,
So how much of a percent of your body mass is that?
well,
Yes. I think I
Body
just really
mass.
want to
That's
understand that
actually
graph, and I'm not yet sure I do. So I feel like one thing I maybe get it is that if you have a more complex better model of the world, there's sort of more alpha there. You can sort of optimize in more interesting ways. And then maybe the thing before, the bacteria there that can't even afford that, so it just has to do worst case scenario optimization. But then I'm like, I don't really get it because I'm like, even for the worst case scenario, you need some model, and then like why are the more complex things, could I still model them as worst case scenario optimization, but just in a more complex,
Yeah.
you
So
know, sort of a distribution over possible worst case. I don't know.
yeah. So basically, so if the bacteria were not here to here, we just sort of spell what that would mean, and then you can sort of see the difference. So they have this very stereotype thing where if you show them a particular history of chemoattractant concentration, they then have a particular rate from running to tumbling, which are the 2 actions that they can take. You can imagine that evolution basically told them this is the response that you want for this history. This is the kernel that you want to use, and that's it for the bacteria. For a human-like bacteria, we would sort of be like, okay, here's the history of chemoattractant concentration we've seen. Let's now optimize that kernel for the specific situation that we're in.
As in one case there is learning, in another case there's no learning.
So it would be learning in all cases. It would just sort of be like, well, we're not in the worst case scenario, so we should not have this particular kernel. We should have a different kernel.
So
Or
we're
it's
maybe
conditional,
adapting to
'cause
the
like-
context rather than
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think like to Nora's point of like you could still have context tell you what is the worst case in that context.
Yeah.
You still could have context telling you that this is. So just bacteria do not have it. They say this is the worst case scenario, like overall, and then.
Yeah. So I'm starting to be able to exclude. Oh, I'm not in that in those fractions of the world.
Yes.
So I can start ignore those worst case scenarios. But in the distribution of worlds that I'm like, I'm still plausible in any of these. I might still do some of
You could still do worst case, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I would say, but then what that would require is that you have something that's actually sensing the context of the world, some part of your body, brain, whatever, is sensing the context of the world, and it's making then a quick calculation or a long calculation of like, this is the kernel that I should have in order to do well or not badly in that part of the world.
But then I'm sort of surprised that it's discontinuous. Like I feel like didn't maybe say for even the bacteria case, there's sort of two modes. So there are still sort of.
Oh no,
choosing
there are two
to-
actions. It's not choosing. It's there's just one mode, and there are two
Okay.
actions that it can take, and it's having a particular like probabilistic relationship between the two actions.
Okay, so the discontinuity is to go from this one context versus like that.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm understanding a theory of mind in this case. I mean, the bacteria is not quite developing a theory of mind, it's developing a theory of its environment.
It
right?
doesn't even have a theory of its environment. Really. I mean,
But that's
it's,
not exactly, I mean, it doesn't in the sense of a neural system, but it does in the sense of something in the DNA or something, right?
so it has like this evolutionary pre-programmed response of how to respond to chemoattractant concentrations, and it has the ability to sense chemoattractant concentrations, but it doesn't have the ability to sense like the context has switched. It doesn't need to worry so much about it being in the worst case environment. So I would say it doesn't really have that theory of mind. It basically assumes everything is going to be worst case.
When you say it can exist in multiple contexts, like worst case, or when it's complex enough to recognize that it's not in the worst case scenario, why do you call that a theory of mind? Which mind is it developing a theory of?
So is it maybe the better way to say it is it would have sort of a theory of the environment, and the theory of the environment would involve a theory of mind. So for example, the bacteria isn't looking at the other bacteria and saying, oh, you're trying to ascend the gradient too, and there are all these other bacteria who are trying to ascend the gradient, and it's sort of monitoring like how many bacteria are doing that, and then making a calculation for how quickly the gradient is going to vanish.
I see. So the context is dependent on the other competing bacteria, which it then has to model in a theory of mind. I see.
Why did you not want to call this learning or the
Agency?
I'm a bit tempted to be like the bacteria is only adapting to the context, given its sort of pre-perceived input-output patterns. Whereas like maybe the more complex thing can sort of like learn, you know, a wider set of possible contexts and which context it's in. But you push back against the learning point.
So yeah, so I would not say that it's learning a context at all, because it just has pre-assumed the context, and that's it.
So you can't learn new context.
Yeah, that's right.
Sorry, we're at like 32 minutes, so if you want to, finish up and
This
bring us
last
home.
slide is untested biologically. I have an idea for how to test this, but I don't think I'm going to get to it for like a decade. Projective function. There's like a footnote in a rate distortion theory textbook that says that finding like a point that finding like the linear dynamical system with Gaussian noise that gets you to exactly the right point on the curve does not mean that this is how you actually want to do it. If you're going to do a good job with coding, it's speculative phase transition, and it's getting published in the project. And if you have papers, please submit to special issues. I just have to put this in here. So if you have any information theoretic methods in computational neuroscience papers that are sort of strange or whatever, where you think it would be appropriate for entropy, because entropy is sort of like sometimes strange stuff and sometimes very standard stuff. I like journals sometimes. Please submit. And there's also something that is going on in computational brain behavior. If you have something on prediction, let us know. Thank you.
So I'm trying to disentangle this a bit, talking about evolution of bacteria from Dick Walensky's work involving E. coli over the last 35 years. And there we see spontaneously, there's no sort of task or Marzen computational interpretation of behavior, but in fact what he shows is that there's functional equilibrium that spontaneously arises. And you have change in body size, and they do become more fit over time.
Yeah.
The reproduction rate, that's the proxy in evolution for fitness. So how should I have a computational interpretation of this functional equilibrium that the E. coli are doing decade after decade? Or, I don't know, it seemed like the context for the surrounding work was somehow focused on particular tasks, but it looks like just regular evolution, even kind of neutral evolution, does this sort of adaptation, body mass changing, you know,
So one question I have about that is, okay, so they took a particular lab strain for this Lonnie paper. What if they took a lab strain from the Walensky experiments from later and did the same thing? Would the cardinal have changed because it's in such a different environment for such a long time? So I don't know. Thanks for letting me talk for so long.
Thanks, Sarah.
So Alec, the
I think
plan
we're-
now